When a university professor publicly tried to humiliate young Barron Trump by mocking his faith, he never imagined the response Barron would deliver would shock the entire auditorium. What unfolded that day wasn't just an intellectual debate. It was the unforgettable story of a young man standing strong, defending both his faith and intelligence. Watch this video carefully, because what you're about to see will deeply move you. It happened at an exclusive conference held at one of America's prestigious universities. Barron Trump, who was known for his academic achievements, drew everyone's attention as he entered the auditorium. However, what awaited him was not a warm welcome, but harsh criticism aimed at his beliefs. The speaker, Professor Andrew Hartman, was a well-known atheist recognized for his sharp tongue and aggressive rhetoric. His lectures often felt like performances, openly mocking religious beliefs. He was prepared to do exactly that again today, but what he didn't know was that Barron Trump was no ordinary student. As Professor Hartman stepped onto the podium, his eyes immediately found Barron, and he gave a slight smirk. Today we have a very special guest among us. Many of you might recognize him. Barron Trump. I hope you're here to learn some science, because this lecture won't be about fairy tales and legends. It will be about facts. Giggles echoed through the hall. Barron remained composed, quietly listening to the professor's words. The professor continued. We must now understand that believing in God is a weakness, an unscientific mindset. Studies show clearly that as IQ levels rise, religious belief declines. This is a fact supported by research. Perhaps young Mr. Trump can share his own thoughts on this topic, if he has the courage, that is. All eyes turned to Barron. He calmly stood up and responded in a clear, steady voice. Professor, I'd be happy to respond to your interesting claim. But don't you think judging a person's intelligence solely by their belief system is an academic prejudice? The professor was taken aback. He hadn't expected such a calm and clear counter from Barron. Barron continued, You claim to speak in the name of science, yet you forget that many of history's greatest scientists believed in God. Were great minds like Newton, Pascal, and Faraday lacking in intelligence? The professor, visibly irritated, shot back quickly. Those names belong in the dusty pages of history. Today's science relies on evidence. Show me proof, young man. Barron smiled slightly. Professor, science explains how life functions, but it cannot explain why life exists. Science tells us how the universe formed, but not why it was formed. To me, true intelligence is being open-minded enough to accept that some things remain unknown. Professor Hartman's face turned red. The atmosphere in the hall began shifting. Barron's calm and logical explanations had started to influence the students. Then tell me this, the professor said, unable to hide the anger in his voice. If God exists, why can't science prove it? Barron replied without hesitation. Science still can't fully explain gravity. Does the fact that something isn't yet fully explained mean it doesn't exist? That's precisely what faith is, trusting in something we cannot yet fully see, but whose presence we deeply feel. Murmurs rose in the room. Barron's words had clearly sparked thoughtful reflection among many students. The mocking expression had long vanished from Professor Hartman's face, replaced by profound unease. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the podium. He tried to look away, but couldn't tear his gaze from Barron's calm and confident stance. Everyone in the room held their breath, awaiting the professor's response. The professor remained silent for a moment. Then he took a deep breath and leaned toward his microphone again. Mr. Trump, he said, his voice tense but still defiant, your words are impressive, I'll admit. But can you provide a concrete example of faith and science coexisting? Not abstract philosophy. Let's talk about a real-world example. Seeing the professor unexpectedly continue his resistance, Barron gently nodded without losing his composure. Of course, Professor, he said. Surely you've heard of Francis Collins. He led the Human Genome Project and is one of the world's foremost scientists. Not only is he an esteemed scientist, but he's also a deeply devout Christian. Collins, who sits at the pinnacle of genetic science, has repeatedly stated that the more scientific truths he uncovers, the stronger his faith becomes. The audience listened even more attentively after Barron provided this example. The professor's expression had gone beyond mere discomfort. It was clear that deep internal questioning had begun. Yet he was still desperately searching for something to cling to. What about the faith-driven conflicts throughout history? The professor asked sharply. Hasn't belief often limited people's thinking? Barron calmly responded once again. Professor, the conflicts you speak of stem not from faith itself, but from people misusing faith for their own interests. Hasn't science also led to destructive outcomes when misused? The real issue isn't what you believe, but how you use your beliefs. Barron's words drew a few approving nods from students, silently expressing their support. Professor Hartman had gone quiet. The young man in front of him had calmly, consistently, and logically countered every one of his arguments. Finally, Barron looked directly at the professor and spoke in a quieter voice. Perhaps the real question, Professor, is this. Is your trust in science genuinely about science itself, or is it about your blind devotion to your own version of truth? The silence in the room deepened even more. The mask on the professor's face finally fell. For years, he had questioned his students, ridiculed their faith, and considered himself an undisputed authority in the name of science. Now, for the first time, he experienced an internal conflict. Barron's words had been nothing short of a mirror held up to himself. Professor Hartman cleared his throat as if wanting to quickly respond, but he couldn't. After a long silence, when he finally spoke, his voice was unusually weak. Mr. Trump, Perhaps I need to reconsider some of my positions. I'll reflect upon what you said here today. These were words the professor had never uttered in his entire career. Students exchanged surprised glances, while Barron politely inclined his head, saying, "Thank you for listening to me, Professor." As students began leaving the hall, whispers had already begun circulating. Professor Hartman remained standing thoughtfully behind the podium. His colleague, Professor Miller, approached him gently and touched his shoulder. "Andrew, are you all right?" Miller asked, concern evident in his voice. Professor Hartman took a deep breath, looked up slowly, smiled slightly, and met his colleague's eyes. "Perhaps for the first time in my life, I learned something genuinely important today," he said. "This young man showed me that clinging blindly to my beliefs isn't scientific. It's dogmatic. It's difficult to admit, but he's right." Miller nodded quietly. "Maybe this event reminds all of us that true science is about questioning and learning." Professor Hartman took another deep breath and nodded with a faint smile. "You're right. From now on, instead of belittling my students, I'll learn to listen to them." That day, Barron Trump didn't just defend his faith. He proved that even the deepest prejudices could be questioned. Sometimes the strongest argument is a calm, determined stance and the courage to respectfully defend what you believe. Do you think Barron Trump's words genuinely changed Professor Hartman's beliefs? Is it really possible to break through people's prejudices? What did this story teach you? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications for more inspiring stories. See you in our next video.